This is Damian Macy, and I represent the Friends of the Marshall Public Library, and I'm in the dining room of Mary Ann Stepp's home for an interview for the Oral History Project for the library. And with that, I'm going to introduce you to Mary Ann.
Hello. I was born in Terre Haute at Union Hospital in 1942. I don't mind saying that. My parents are Helen Coldren and Basil Moore. I have one sister, Susan, 2 years younger, who is married to Charles Renner, also from Marshall. My husband is Terry Stepp, who was born in Marshall also. We lived at Moore Funeral Home upstairs, which my parents owned. I've been away a few years, but most of my life has been here in Marshall. There were other children in our neighborhood that we played with. We had a wonderful time. I don't think the neighborhood has changed too much in these years. Although when I was young, right across the street was Croc's grocery store, Bud and Eileen and their daughter Carol Ann. And on the corner was Meade Dunkel's nursing home. That's where Kirchner Building Center is now. And the Catholic Church across the street to the south. Susan and I spent a lot of time with Carolyn and Janice Smitley, who lived a block behind us on 5th Street. And then behind them, in the early years, were the Ilyases. Mother, Sister Clarine, and her husband Frank, Dr. Frank, and their children, Bob, Jane, Barbara, and Margaret.
Mary Ann, sometimes people have that feeling of maybe, living in a funeral home. Wouldn't that be weird? I don't know if I could do that. Did you ever have that kind of feeling or have questions about that?
Okay, that's a good question. No, it never bothered me. It was all I ever knew. My parents bought the funeral home when I was very young. I don't remember living anyplace else. We were living there when Susan was born. And when we were young, those were the days when people for a visitation would come and just sit and stay. And there often were 2 nights of visitation. So often, Mother and Daddy would have Susan and me just sit on the steps, the bottom steps, and where they could see us and we could see other people. And then as we got older, we would be upstairs during visitation, and sometimes other children would come up also, but we always had to remember not to make a lot of noise upstairs, and not to, because the sound would come down. And if we got a little noisy, sometimes Mother or Daddy would flip the lights. There was a light switch downstairs, and the light in the hall upstairs would go off and on, and that was our signal that we needed to quiet down.
That was their subtle hint. Huh?
Right. And in those days, we only had one bathroom upstairs, so people, now it sounds awful, but at the time, people would come upstairs and go down the hall and use our restroom.
Well, they did. That's why I was wondering if people sometimes just out of curiosity would venture upstairs, or...
Well, I don't remember that happening, but the hallway went straight down the hall to the bathroom, so we could have the other doors closed, and they would just go down the hall to the bathroom. Of course, then when they added on to the funeral home, they put in a bathroom downstairs. And I don't know when that was. Late 50s, I think.
All right. Susan, Mary Ann, I remember at that time, and going back many years, a lot of visitations used to take place in the private home, and the funeral director would set up and take the body to the private home. Did your dad do that much, or do you recall?
I have heard Daddy talk about that. Before he came to Marshall, he worked at a funeral home in Flora. Ed Hancock was that funeral director. And I remember him talking about going to the homes then. I think they even prepared the body in the home and had visitation there. And it's possible that he still did that in Marshall. Sorry, I should have taken that off.
That's all right. That's all right.
Oh, it's one of those unknown anyway.
We're talking about your life and your early childhood, living in the funeral home. Did you have some chores and some things that needed to be done for the business that you and your sister had?
Yes, we did. Before they added on to the funeral home, the chapel also was used for funerals, but then it was also used for when people came in to make their funeral arrangements and to make the casket selection. So the caskets had to be moved into that, we called it the big room, and then back. And Susan and I helped set up chairs and put away chairs after the funeral. We helped some carry the flowers into the big room. Mother would be the one to, and Daddy, place them. We helped answer the door as we got older. And we weren't allowed to answer the phone until I think we were probably close to our teen years, because at that time the funeral home also had the ambulance service.
Right.
And they couldn't take the chance on a child answering the phone and not getting the correct information. So before we were allowed to answer the phone, Daddy would put us through some practices that we had to say who's calling and where, give a specific address and write it down. I think those were probably the main things.
I guess this is a good time probably to talk a little bit about your mother and dad. They were just such wonderful people. I knew them well, and your dad was always so personable, great to be in that business, and your mother, a marvelous musician. Tell a little bit about them.
Okay, I'm real proud of my parents. Daddy, Basil Moore, was born in Mount Vernon, started school there. His dad died when he was 16.
Hello.
So after and he quit school at that time to help support his mother. And then his mother remarried and they moved to Flora, and Daddy went back and got his high school diploma. Then he went to mortuary school in St. Louis. He did some kind of odd jobs, sold made-to-measure shirts. He operated a cleaning business. And then he worked for Mr. Hancock in Flora, and then he was working for Mr. Blau at the Blau Funeral Home when Mr. Blau passed away rather suddenly.
And that was here in Marshall, I believe,
Yes,
wasn't it?
yes, it was the same funeral home then. And then he and Mother purchased that funeral home. Someplace around 1944. I don't know the exact year.
Your dad was in Rotary, and I, of course, got to know him there many years ago. And I believe he told me one time that he actually had a dry cleaning business here in Marshall early in his years here.
He did, and I don't know exactly the sequence of all that. I wish I did,
Okay.
but I don't.
I think it was upstairs, he said, on the south side of Archer Avenue, along about where where Nancy's gallery is. I don't know if that was the building or not, but along in that area is where he was telling me about. And I don't remember exactly the location either.
I don't know the exact. Upstairs.
It was upstairs, he told me.
I do remember that part, but I don't know exactly where. When Mother and Daddy were first married, well, they were married in 1938, and Mother was the second to the oldest of 6 children. And only 6 weeks after they were married, her mother passed away. She had had tuberculosis, and in those days, that was incurable. And I don't know for how many years she lived in just a little house behind the family home because it was contagious. The tuberculosis was contagious, and I guess that was what they did in those days. So, and then 2 years later, Mother's father passed away. This was Harry and Anna Coldren. Harry Coldren was a sheriff at one time in Marshall. So someplace along in there, Mother and Daddy moved back into the family home. Mother's sisters were Rosamond, the older one, who never married, Clarine Ilias, Anne Shaw, Imogene Fritcher, and their only brother, Harry, who was nicknamed Bill, lived away most of the years after he got out of school. He went to service, and then he married a girl, Dorothy, in the state of Maryland, and they lived there most of the time. Came back here for a few years, and at one time owned the home where Damien and Eleanor Macy now live. So Mother and Daddy lived for several years in the home on Vine Street with, I think it was Rose and Anne and Imogene. Let's see, where else shall I go with that? And then they bought the funeral home and lived there until Daddy retired in the 60s. I don't know the exact year. And then Ed Pierce bought the funeral home. And as Damien said, Daddy was active in Rotary and in our church, the First Methodist Church. He was a Lincoln Scholar and did a lot of programs about Abraham Lincoln. He was a storyteller. He told mostly funny things about Mr. Lincoln. He did a lot of traveling to do those talks.
I believe he did a lot, not only with Lincoln, but was it Will Rogers?
Yes.
Okay, some marvelous programs there.
Yes, they were. There's a book put together of his Lincoln stories, Wit and Wisdom of Abraham Lincoln, I think is the title. And he was going to also do one on his stories about Will Rogers, and then that did not come to pass. Daddy passed away in 96. No, he had a stroke in 96. He passed away in 99. Then a little more about Mother. She grew up in Marshall. As I said, her dad was sheriff for several years. At the time he was sheriff, the family lived in the home right by the jail, which now has been torn down. And their mother would do the cooking for the prisoners. When Mother graduated from high school, then she got a 2-year degree at, what was that time, I think, Indiana State Normal in Terre Haute. And she taught in Marshall. Then when she was married in 1938, at that time, married women were not allowed to be teachers here. So then she taught in the Edgar County schools. She was a traveling music teacher. And I've heard her say sometimes she would even have to ford a stream to get to her country schools. And I can imagine she was very good at that. I think the children were very fond of her, and of course for them that was quite a treat. I don't know how often they had music. I don't know if it was even once a week.
I rather doubt it, because my mother taught in a one-room school, and I think it was doing good maybe every 2 weeks, or sometimes maybe only once a month.
Okay. So Mother taught, and then I was born in December of 42. Then she was very involved in the funeral home with Daddy. She helped with the families, answering the door and the phone, and most of the time she played for the funerals. They had a Hammond organ, and she played beautifully. She also did a lot with music in our church, playing the pipe organ, directing the choir, and she was the director of the Legion Auxiliary Choir that won many state and national awards, mostly in the 50s, I think. It was a wonderful group of women who were also good friends, and they made beautiful harmony. 2 of her sisters also were in the group, Ann Shaw and Emma Jean Coldren. And those women stayed good friends of hers the rest of her life.
And watching your mother play piano or organ or whatever it was, just looking at her, she enjoyed it. You could tell by her expression and her accents and her expression, she was really enjoying music.
Yes, I think I'm sure she had a God-given talent. She often played with no music. She could transpose music practically in her head.
And that's a real knack. I think your dad told me one time that he actually met your mother at an unusual place where she was performing.
The story I've heard is that she played for Rotary when the Rotarians sang. Yes. Is that
That's
the one you're
what I
talking
understand.
about?
And then she also played at the old theater because there were no sound tracks on the film at that time. And the main source of expression was piano. And
Yes.
she was the pianist.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think she might have done that even when she was still in high school. Let's see, she graduated from high school in 29, and I don't know when the silent movies were played here. But yes, she did play for the silent films.
Okay, with the wonderful story again about your parents, it's good to have that. I see it gave you some things to even think about. And maybe kind of switching gears back now to your career, and I mean, you were a teacher for a while.
Yes. After I graduated from high school, I went to Indiana State and got a bachelor's degree there. I graduated high school in '61. Terry and I were married in '63, and then had 2 more years of college. Terry and I taught in LaGrange, Illinois, just for a few years. That's where our son Jeff was born. And then Terry came back to ISU as a residence hall director for 2 years in the late '60s. That was a pleasant experience. We enjoyed that a lot. We had a nice apartment in the residence hall, and our daughter Ellen was born.
Was that Parsons Hall by any chance?
No, it was Hendricks Hall. There are the twin towers that now are going to be torn down, but it was new when we lived there. And our daughter Ellen was born there. Then after just a couple more years, we came to Marshall and bought our home on Spruce Street, where we still live. I think we've been here 44 years, since 71, I believe. And I taught at elementary school at South School, retiring in 2002. I taught for 34 years.
What grades did you primarily teach?
I had Title I reading, so I had all the grades. When I first started at South School, it was, the grades there went up through 6. And then in later years, our school just had the lower grades while I was still there. It was a wonderful teaching career. Mr. Bush was superintendent when I was hired. We had a lot of good teachers, and the families were good to work with, the parents. It was a good experience.
Do you think it might have been a better experience then than now? It seems to me there's a lack of maybe regard and respect for authority and teachers and police and all. Do you think that has changed quite a bit?
Yes, it definitely has. Yeah. I think it's much more difficult to be a teacher today than it was when I started in the 70s.
Has there been an event or a person in your past life that you feel was the biggest influence that really maybe channeled your career or influenced you the most?
Well, of course, my parents were a big influence. Mother had been a teacher. I always admired my mother very much, and my dad. But I think the person who had a lot to do with my going to college was Mildred Bush. She was a high school teacher, and when I graduated from college in 1961, there weren't very many girls going on to college at that time. And she really encouraged me too. And of course, so did Mother and Daddy, but sometimes at that age, I think maybe you listen to someone
else
outside your family a little more.
Mildred, as I recall, did she teach business?
Yes, she did.
Okay, but you were not really directly involved in
Well, I
business
took
career.
business classes in high school. In those days, we learned shorthand. I did shorthand, and I was in it was called FBLA, the Future Business Leaders. Yes, so I was in high school, yes. And I worked half days in Mr. Bush's office when he was superintendent. Also, in those times, a lot of students who had their required classes were allowed to work half a day. And Mr. Bush was influential also in my going on to college.
And I think he was a good friend of your father's also.
Yes.
Very close.
Mildred sang in the auxiliary choir. Yes, my parents and the Bushes were good friends.
Looking back, is there a particular event in history or some unique thing that has happened that really stands out in your mind the most?
You mean during my lifetime? Oh, I wish I could think of something.
We've seen a lot of changes, I know, in automation in schools and everything. What conveniences, modern conveniences, that you really are saying, oh, these have really changed my life or changed the way I live?
Well, the technology. Computers, we started using computers while I was still teaching. The old ones that you had to put the disk in the drive, and of course that has changed so much. And now I still substitute teach, and in the elementary schools even the students can work on iPads. And of course everyone has cell phones, and I'm certainly not up to speed on all of that, but the kids can all do it. You know, if we have trouble with our computer or our cell phone, our grandchildren can fix it for us.
You always say if you can't program your VCR, just ask one of the grandkids.
Right, right.
I guess that's the modern technology that we live in. Because reading down at the grade school in South School, every room has a row of computers along the side. Seems like kids can all use them just
They
super
can,
fun.
and it's wonderful.
If you were, again, you've come back to Marshall after being in LaGrange, I believe you said, for a while, and in Terre Haute. And we moved back to Marshall and found it a pretty good place to live. If you were in another country somewhere and you got to know someone quite well, what would you tell them about Marshall and why it's a good place to live here?
Okay, it's a small community. It's a well-kept community, nice and clean, streets and sidewalks. And the people are, I think, more than just friendly. They're genuinely caring about each other. I think our schools are very good. Our churches, we're a decent distance from Terre Haute, Indianapolis, Champaign, if you're looking for more to do than is offered just here in Marshall. We have some very nice homes. I think those are the main things I think of.
Well, thank you, Mary Ann. It's been a pleasure visiting with you. And again, I especially enjoyed talking to you about your parents, who I think just about everyone in Marshall knew or had an association with somewhere along the way. And we're delighted to have you express this and tell a little bit about yourself. And we hope this is on record for many people to enjoy in the future. Again, thank you. We appreciate it.
Okay, and thank you.